Thanks very much, Andy, for that introduction. Today, it gives me the great pleasure to once again act as chair for the African Mining Summit for the 7th year since inception. It's been a tremendous journey, and today and for this subject a matter of our conference, balancing the metals and minerals green paradox for net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, a massively topical and to some degree controversial subject. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of the African Mining Summit and its contribution to development on the continent. As I said, I've had the pleasure of chairing the AMS now 7 years, which has been in development by the organizers, GRV Global, a tremendous job they've done. And it's an event that was described by the co-host and patron, the African Union Commissioner of Trade and Industry, Ambassador Almut Machanga, as an institution which was growing from strength to strength. Now, this event's been supported by the AU, and it's been designed to generate alignment, understanding between member states, ministers and ministries of mines and energy, and the private sector, and to join these key stakeholders in Africa to engage on a formal basis in developing and shaping exploitation of Africa's continental and coastal natural resources, and of course its related industrial profile. This event really does stand out as the true Pan-African platform for policy debate and for mobilizing the private sector within the African mining vision, really as a blueprint for structural transfer of African economies. And the private sector compact, which has been under execution for a couple of years now, as a tool to facilitate dialogue and reduce and share risk that's created within the African minerals governance framework. Within this event, the panel sessions that are chaired by senior industry leaders are most informative, at times controversial, but in a positive way. And they cover topical issues, and question and debate from delegate and audience participation is strongly interactive. It's really about realizing the African mining vision and addressing important minerals and metals and attracting exploration dollars to increase Africa's share of global spend over and above the Fraser Institute's reported approximately 14% over the last few years. Discussion and debate on balancing internal political demands with competition for the available dollars has highlighted that trust and negotiating and contracting for full downstream industries creation, with a focus on transparency and really avoiding any over-sophistication, has been the key to success. Other key elements of project sustainability and the changing nature of the funding environment that we find ourselves in particular private equity, equipment and technology providers, streaming and royalty companies, all are to be noted as funders continuing to grow in significance on the continent, and the trading houses of old becoming more of a last resort and typically being higher cost to the mining companies. Of course, we mustn't forget the impact of the digital era on the African mining industry and the challenges that we're facing as a result of differences in requirements and the view of mining investors and mining companies versus government. The first, of course, being risk and investment management, and being always must be return focused. And the second, compliance and reporting, focused to levy taxes and royalties. The mining value chain is by necessity being digital reworked to accommodate both stakeholders' needs and expectations. Future technology trends, developing people, mining impact, and corporate social responsibility and sector legal concerns, especially around mining charters, localization of equity ownership, carried interests and empowerment principles are also key areas of debate and discussion between stakeholders. But in conclusion, the African Mining Summit has continued to offer all stakeholders and investors on the continent strong fundamentals in the business and in the progressive project developments. What I would like to talk about as part of my address is really one of the major subjects is improving the energy mix and energy return on investment in the short and long term. The concept of energy return on investment is really based upon the fact that all motion and action both generates and consumes energy in all its forms, i.e. human energy, heat energy, kinetic energy, electrical energy, mechanical energy, etc. Unfortunately, this is poorly understood or even considered in the past, and even in many, if not most, of the current designs for natural resource exploitation projects and mines. Therefore, mining companies today really need to get a grip on this concept such that they can integrate and optimize energy balancing across the human, engineering, equipment and technology, process, operations monitoring, measurement and management control systems, and all these areas and disciplines that make up a sustainable production unit. Energy is the key to everything, both now and the future. And we're on a continent that is drastically energy starved at the current moment. This should be uniquely tailored then for each mineral, metal or natural resource deposit that's planned to be exploited as it moves along the value chain. Short term, in early stage to longer term execution, and from discovery to concept and preliminary economic assessment, to pre-feasibility, through bankable feasibility, to front-end engineering design and detailed engineering with construction, and finally to commissioning and ramp up. This energy demand, this energy balance is critically important for the success of the future. This process, of course, will ultimately speak and report to the individual company's environmental and social governance policy, which has become front and center across the globe now in terms of mining and mineral resource development. Goals and achievement of these ESG policies to attract the right kind and levels of investment required is paramount. Part of the objective of achieving the optimum energy return on investment will of course be embedded within the direct electrical energy requirement, consumption, and the generation or source mix. Because of the very nature of our industry, many, if not most, new discoveries and mines are in remote areas devoid of supporting energy infrastructure. And achieving the most desirable low carbon emission supply is a major challenge, especially in Africa. Others may be in the vicinity of grid or baseload supply, but lack of supply capacity issues, particularly in Africa and also Latin America, have had a tendency to prevail. This predicates that the balancing of the final energy generation and supply mix toward a low carbon footprint will be a medium to longer term journey for most, and is not a switch with instant carbon neutrality as it tends to be demanded by funders and governments alike. Again, each mine and exploitation site will be unique and require a specific plan for the life of mine energy mix journey. There are a number of specific trends, however, that have been observed in recent times. The trends that are prevalent very much depends on the geography, level of economic development prevailing, and is often opposed by counter-developmental and confused regulatory environment, matched and underscored by rhetoric-fueled incompetent politics. We see a lot of that on a global basis. It's not unique to Africa. This is also impacted by the maturity, the degree of development and levels of investment that's being made in mining and natural resources sector in any country or jurisdiction within a country, and varies greatly on a global basis. The two leading jurisdictions or benchmarks globally are clearly Canada and Australia in this regard, then followed perhaps by Mexico. But there are some African countries such as Botswana, Namibia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Niger, and Sudan. All are moving to deregulate, encourage, and incentivize integrated investment in energy metals and energy fuels. And clear specific trends that have been observed are capital deployment is focused to capture green-related mineral resources and metals toward renewable energy generation and storage to offset emissions. There's a growing contrarian investment in mining and energy construction for green manufacturing, i.e. battery factories, electric vehicles, solar panels, etc. There's certainly increased investment at home in what the politicians term our green economy, value chain elements and technologies, including conversion and retrofitting of existing industry. Increased exploration and new technology is being applied, in particular using artificial intelligence. Silver demand growth for solar panels is being constrained in the future simply by the regaining of silver's recognition as a precious metal and sound money. And this may prove to be counterproductive in terms of the availability of silver for green technology, in particular solar panels. Palladium and platinum has been repositioning as energy metals for both use in emissions control and hydrogen fuel cells. Environmental and social governance driven demand for ethical metals. They talk about ethical copper, nickel and cobalt for EV batteries. And basically that's talking about no use of child labor, general and strong application of environmental and social governance principles. Expanded development of mining for vanadium for grid scale batteries, and manganese for new generation EV batteries is also very much at the fore. And even thermal coal for baseload energy generation, liquid fuels production and aromatics, which are related to LOHC or liquid organic hydrogen carrier production, in particular in the SADC region, India and Southeast Asia. One of the lessons we've still got to learn in the world is that we need cheap energy to create cheap energy. And cheap energy in our case really is thermal coal, baseload power. And this will give us the ability to create cheap energy to eradicate hydrocarbons in the long term, but it's not going to be in the short term. Uranium, of course, we mustn't forget. Uranium will continue to grow in importance as nuclear power is realized more as the most carbon neutral energy form and aligned with safer technologies for generations such as small modular reactors. And Africa is very well endowed in uranium resources. Another aspect which is key to this is that in the meeting of the prevalent political rhetoric, there are several dimensions to this. First is the many irresponsible statements made in abandon by politicians on a global scale, mainly in the Western Hemisphere, of goals with metrics and timeframes related thereto, regarding the rollout of green technologies, inter alia solar PV, wind farms, electric vehicles, energy storage centers, etc. And none of these have any basis in reality and are basically a wish list and have been quite damaging towards development of such metals and minerals in Africa, because simply these politicians and their advisors have not done the math with respect to raw material inputs into these technologies. Second, the same politicians then, with no understanding of the value chain, immediately create and pass restrictive and prescriptive legislation with no awareness or care about the consequences. And I'm specifically speaking about ESG or environmental and social governance and permitting requirements and the restrictions legislated on the value chain from discovery all the way through to production for the increase in raw materials that are going to be required and are required to meet the much lauded goals of these politicians for green energy. If we make a comparison of the permitting and time requirements compared to 20 years ago, let's say to develop a 40,000 ton per annum copper or nickel mine from discovery to sustainable production. 20 years ago, the time required was around 8 to 10 years from discovery to nameplate production. That has now moved to 15 to 20 years and has added a cost growth multiple of approximately 10 times over the same time period. Therefore, if we require green, and let's say we need an additional 4 million tons per annum of copper by 2030, has been a number that's been well bandied about, we actually need 100 new mines or expanded production units, but within the permit and regulatory requirements that have been legislated in the last few years, never mind the capital requirements, these goals simply cannot be met and are a pipe dream. So if we consider specifically the capital levels that are required, a new 40,000 ton per annum copper mine in 2020 financial terms costs between $40,000 and $60,000 per ton of copper cathode production, inclusive of discovery, depending on the ore type, jurisdiction, and level of existing infrastructure. So if we take a median position, for 4 million tons of new copper production at, say, $50,000 per ton, that means we need $200 billion and 15 years at best in order to fill that demand. Add then inflation, add fiat currency depreciation, unknown delays, and you're likely looking at 2 times to 4 times this cost and 20 years or beyond to deliver. This math simply hasn't been done by the political machine. Of course, to develop green technology, we also need nickel. And with the much bandied about number is 2 million tons of nickel at minimum. The development costs for nickel are double copper at $80,000 to $120,000 per ton of production. If you then add cobalt, lithium, graphite, manganese, vanadium, then we're looking at least $1.6 to $1.8 trillion in 2020 terms. If you then again add inflation, fiat currency depreciation, and it's very easy to arrive at $4 to $5 trillion over the next 20 years. I mean, these numbers are quite staggering, and until you do the math and you look at it, you don't realize just how big they are. Some agencies like the World Bank, IMF, IFC, and the EBRD have recently published their version of what it's required in terms of investment just by governments, not private companies, just by governments. And the numbers varied between $1.6 trillion to $2 trillion between now and 2030. So this clearly indicates that the Fed and the European Central Bank and other central banks are going to be printing huge as we move forward to fund all of this, and adds further certainty that modern monetary theory and a big financial reset is certainly coming in the future. It's definitely no longer an if, but a when. Another subject that's really, I think, close to all miners' hearts is the massive red herring that states that anthropogenic climate change is an existential threat. And the mining industry and, excuse me, miners have been much maligned as contributing to this. Well, let's just look at this for a moment. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed in 1990 as a think tank. That's all it was. And then they came up with all these hypothetical assertions on global warming that became a pseudoscience based only on factors propagated and published as confirming factors. There was no opposites or negative evidence ever considered. Western political powers in particular, and central bankers, saw an immediate opportunity to blame and tax humanity for its purported transgressions against itself and the world. And Africa has suffered much from this. This hypothesis became a new religion, driven for political gain and legal robbery of society for something which really, in truth, they have little or no control over. This religion still continues with ongoing claims by the latest IPCC that if we don't stop producing CO2, the temperature will go up by 1.5 degrees C by 2030. And basically, we will all be inundated by such extremes in weather that life as we know it will be over. Anthropogenic climate change impacts are massively overstated. Let me say that again. Anthropogenic climate change impacts are massively overstated. In fact, by many orders of magnitude. The natural climate change of Earth by geological and global geographical forces outperform human impacts by many thousands of times each decade. The term climate change is a new term, relatively, adopted by the socio-political machine when real science proved that in the previous term, global warming, that was in fact not happening or provable, and quite the opposite in fact, after they had to change the statistics and manipulate them many times. So this change in terminology has happened because we definitely do have impact evidence and can prove that climate impacts have changed, but not all negatively and not all anthropogenic. Or at least our human perception of the impacts has been that these changes and climate change has been felt more on the world's populated land masses as the Earth shifted on its axis over the last 150 odd years. And this has been well reported by NASA and other geoscientist reports in the last couple of years. I mean, this demonstrated by the measured magnetic field of the Earth having moved due to continental drift, macrogeological forces within the continental drift, and activities along the Earth's subduction zones that's caused earthquakes, high-frequency volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. All of this has resulted in greater landfall of these events, these impactful weather events, such as typhoons, cyclones, and hurricanes. Although it's important to state that in absolute numbers measured globally, and I've studied this intensively over the last decade, these absolute numbers have not increased. Also, we have recorded drier areas becoming wetter, deserts greening positively due to CO2 levels, but none of these positive impacts are reported. So, is climate change an existential threat as portrayed? Absolutely not. This is clear misdirection of the highest order and scare tactics used by politicians to drive their causes and taxes and legislation against the natural resources industry is really criminal. And we need to stand out against this. The realities are, can we expect climate change to continue? The answer is yes. Is rising CO2 levels an existential threat? The answer is no. Are noxious gases like carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide from smelters, etc., local threats and regional threats in the industrial focal points, mainly in the developed world in the Northern Hemisphere? Yes, they are. Can they be cleaned up using new combustion technologies, dilution and capture for economic use? Yes. Is physical pollution from plastics and other organic and inorganic waste a serious threat? And do we have to control these as miners and natural resource developers? Absolutely yes. Can we clean it up using control technologies and producing useful hydrogen? Yes. And finally, the issue of rising sea levels as a threat. Well, the answer to that is no, because the land masses are sinking and rising naturally as the continental plates move, and in reality, this has very little to do with ice caps melting. Impacts from this will be extremely localized and happen over very long periods of time to allow action to be considered generally. Of course, we have to consider instantaneous sinking or rising or collapse can occur in extreme geological events like earthquakes, and in areas of deep mining where we have underground excavations and seismic activity in seismic zones close to these crustal plates, then yes, we can have events. But these are natural events predominantly, not anthropological. The next subject I'd like to cover is really a one that's going to impact us massively in the years to come. And that is the reset of the global financial system and its impact on the funding for natural resource and mining exploitation. If we look at project generation and funding by banking and institutions in particular, the question that we need to pose is, if climate change is such a big issue, and we're staring at the face of humanity, staring in the face at the end of humanity as we know it inside 20 years, which has been well stated many times recently, then why doesn't a single founding project charter or investment prospectus, excuse me, mention as a key risk for investors climate change? Why are banks still issuing 30 and 40-year mortgage bonds to private citizens and businesses to build coastal properties and, in fact, coastal industries at sea level? Why are institutional funds investing billions in 50-year visions for infrastructure and green solar energy projects when they say the ozone layer will be gone and the Earth's temperature will drop by 35 degrees C? And why are sovereign governments issuing 50, 75, and even 100-year treasury bonds? Well, again, the answer is because it's all a fraud, the greatest perpetrated on humanity over the last century for sure. If it were factual and truth, none of these things would occur. But we need to harness this as natural resource developers on the African continent. And we have to think about, what are the real impacts that can be, particularly with regard to the IPCC indictments on human engineering and mine construction projects, and on the project funding for the future as we know it today. Well, the answer is on a global scale. I mean, relative to natural changes occurring in the earth, the impact of the IPCC and these other parts in real terms are negligible. And therefore, we have to avoid putting too much emphasis and focus on this. There are bigger short-term problems. And from a mining and energy project management perspective, we need to focus fully on stakeholder management on the ground within an ESG framework and dissemination of truth in a communications plan, and steer away from political fantasy in our project risk profiling and planning, especially insofar as it concerns project cost and change control matters. I expect that this approach will manifest itself strongly, and especially within energy generation and energy storage related projects from now going forward. Certainly, artificial intelligence modeling is going to be introduced for algorithmic scenario modeling on project return on investment. I mean, these models are already widely used for trading in the markets. And certainly, I believe that discounted cash flow modeling techniques of the traditional form will disappear as the perception of value creation changes along with the financial system. Regarding specifically the reset of the financial system and its impacts on mining, we must start by looking at where we are now in the macro picture and where we seem to be heading, and then look to precious metals specifically by backing up about 5 years to 2016. So in the macro picture, what do we have? We have current central bank money printing at unprecedented levels and clear fiscal monetary coordination between central banks and government treasuries for fiscal stimulus and propping up the equity markets. Implementation of MMT, or modern monetary theory, in earnest is definitely coming next. There's a strong chance that there's much discussion in several papers I've read recently from the IMF that they are reviewing forgiveness of debts of the developing world. That certainly takes Africa into the equation. And certainly the replacement of fiat currency, paper money, with CBDCs or central bank digital currencies is on the cards. And control of the monetary system through the Internet of Things and blockchain is very much on the cards, and is many projects being piloted by central projects globally now. If we then, as I said, back up a few years and we talk about the general market demand for gold and silver, in 2016, there was almost no demand. But by 2018, the demand had turned and it was good, and also the terms. And by 2020, the demand was overwhelming. And there's a situation of naming of terms for gold supply for all the reasons mentioned in the macro picture that I just mentioned. Gold obviously blew through its all-time high of $2,000 an ounce, despite the potential for all-time highs in the US dollar due to lack of confidence in other fiat currencies and some manipulation. While central banks are attempting to maintain the illusion, gold and silver are inversely correlated to real yields. Commodities in general are and will continue to go up, and gold equities will remain on the charge and will, in my opinion, go ballistic in the next 2 years. We've certainly seen deflation in the second half of 2020. That moved to stagflation in the first half of this year. And with supply shortages across the board and further money printing to try and maintain some momentum. And this has resulted in what we see today, real inflation in the second half of 2021. I believe this is going to accelerate, driven by central banks and politics in support to a really 2023, 2024 larger inflation picture taking off. I believe currencies will be totally debased and depreciated to almost nothing, with metals and equities of producers going ballistic. I mean, we already know the US dollar has depreciated about 95% of its value since the undermining of the gold standard in 1971 by Richard Nixon. The base metal story is an important one, and really it's an energy story, and really an industrial manufacturing of things or stuff story. I mean, the population explosion we've seen over the last 100 years, linked with technology advancement, logistical and economic access, this has transformed demand cycles and curves in many cases to levels which are really approaching exponential. You add to this the political narrative that's driven the anti-carbon sentiment and the constant push for the green economy, in inverted commas, by any means, including disinformation, misinformation, and absolute fraudulent lobbying practices for propagation of untruths. To now you have a situation where almost every base metal commodity will be in a serious deficit by 2024. This deficit would have been manifesting itself already if it were not for the COVID-19 lockdown and the stay of industrial activity. So while the post-COVID-19 recovery and growth in production is definitely going to be slow and a steady rise over the next 5 to 10 years, the demand's definitely going to outstrip supply within the next 2 to 3 years. And this impact is going to be further strengthened by the narrative and demand for the green economy being accelerated. And particularly, this is manifested in energy generation, energy storage, electric vehicles, etc. This means exceptionally large deficits and high prices for critical metals like nickel, cobalt, and of course, copper. This is really tremendous news for our continent. We are endowed with absolutely phenomenal resources of all the critical metals and minerals that are required to support the global green economy. And therefore, I believe we have set the foundation and will continue to go to strength in the time to come. We really are looking forward to this conference. We're looking forward to the other speakers. We're looking to the panel debates on the various subject matters. And finally, I'd like to leave you with some of my predictions for the metal and commodity prices by 2030. And for me, I've made predictions in the past, and so far I've been right. They haven't reached the levels that I said they would reach in the time they would reach, but I was fairly close. But in the outlook to 2030, I definitely can see gold at $3,500 per ounce, silver at $100 an ounce plus, platinum at $1,500, palladium at $2,000 plus. We've already seen palladium well above that and has reset again. Copper definitely at $12,000 per ton and more, given that we need to add at least 4 million tons and potentially 8 million tons of new supply by 2040. Nickel is a similar story. I'm predicting prices north of $22,000 a ton, because really that is the baseline incentive price for new investment at the moment. Anything less than that, and it really doesn't pay the existing major nickel producers to invest. And we're going to need at least 2 million tons and potentially more new nickel. Cobalt's another one. There are attempts at substituting or taking it out, but still I believe cobalt will remain strong and they'll definitely rise to above $90 a pound. We've already moved to adding a further 100,000 tons of new cobalt in the last 5 years. And the projections think that we'll need another 100 to 150,000 tons. So definitely a deficit, definitely price increases there. Zinc has been a star. I predict it will go north of $3,500 a ton. It's already breached 3,000. So it has lots of opportunity to do that in the next few years. And of course, uranium. Uranium, excuse me, I believe will go well north of $90 a pound. I did call the bottom in 2016. It's now come back up to close to $40 a pound from 16 when it was at the low. So lots of momentum going there. So with that, thank you very much to everyone. I trust you have a useful African Mining Summit and you get much out of it. Thank you very much and God bless to all.